Hello, do you hear me?
Hello, I'm here.
Hey, I- if you can say something. And we were very perfect with the previous session. Thank you. That's
It's going in the stream.
yeah. Is it in
I
the
said
stream?
I can't separate stream from Zoom so
Okay.
late in the
Okay, so it's
session.
going on. But can we start the another one now, right? Like different on YouTube, it's a different link.
I already started the
Okay.
see,
Can
it's
we
going.
mute? Okay.
So if you
Welcome. Welcome to this session. I hope you had a good break, some coffee, and bit of a rest. But we are continuing with a very similar kind of line. In the last session, we talked about Eastern Europe as a region and the challenges that we are facing. But we already briefly touched the issue of influence and the meddling of foreign powers in democratization or non-democratization of certain Eastern European countries. So with this session, we will go a bit deep into this issue of how the global powers, that namely Russia, China and the European Union what role are they playing in democratization or in Eastern Europe? Well, Russia and China, of course, are not playing the role of democratization. So what role are they playing in non-democratization? Okay, it's like say like that, and in supporting authoritarian and right-wing, in most of the cases, forces. So we will be having several speakers. So we'll start those who are here. We have Raluca Besliu, from contributor of Green European Journal and other political journals, and a staff member of Green European Foundation. We have Comet, field coordinator in European Green Party, and also a board member of Green European Foundation. And online we are joined by Zarina Burkadze, who is a professor in Ilia State University in Georgia. And we have Anton Cherepenko from Ukraine, who is representing Free Hong Kong Center in Kyiv. So thank you very much who are here, speakers who are in Riga and those who are joining online. We can start with the discussion, and I hope during this session we will also hear some input from your own countries and your own perspectives, maybe during the questions and answers. So we'll first hear input from Zarina, who just published a book which touched the exact same issue of great powers involving in democratization and how the West and the authoritarian countries are meddling, and what role is playing, what role it plays on democratization and democratic forces. And it is a case study, mostly focusing on Georgia, but we also have a comparison to other Eastern European countries, as Azerbaijan, Moldova, Ukraine, and some other cases. So I would like to first give floor to Zarina to share the, let's say, main takeaways from this, and generally also on this topic of influence of global powers in democratization process. So Zarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So it's really timely. I'm delighted to speak at this conference on the future of Eastern Europe, and this session, the Crossroads of Democracy and Autocracy, organized by the Council of European Green Party, is really timely. So let me begin and briefly review how China, Russia, EU, and US influences the political dynamics in Georgia. After Russian invasion of Ukraine, democracy promotion projects were put at risk, and I would rather say not only in Eastern Europe or in the South Caucasus, but also this military aggression puts at stake liberal universalism and European security. So if we look back to the history, the European Union and the United States of America played an effective role in consolidating democracies in Europe and in the post-Soviet space, post-communist space, including Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and such, and Slovakia. And we know this very famous and effective mechanism, the foreign policy tool that was developed by the European Union enlargement process, and this formalized formats of relationships that really positively affect the consolidation process of democracy. However, the rise of global authoritarian powers, we have seen that has threatened the international liberal order, and I would say the main threats to the diffusion of democratic norms remains the autocracy promotion by Russia and China. So China and Russia designed the alternative policy tools and instruments in order to bolster and in order to support illiberal groups in Georgia and elsewhere in order to advance their interests. So these great powers perceive the Western presence in certain geographic areas as an encroachment on their sharply defined spheres of influences. And both China and Russia use soft and hard power tools to influence target countries and their leaders. So let me speak a little bit about the instruments they can that they use. So these are bolstering anti-democratic forces, and if we look back to the Georgian case, we know this far-right radical groups that are trying to be the voice of the majority and try to find their way within the civil society organizations, and they are mainly supported by Russia. And they are trying to also to influence the political landscape in a way to strengthen and enhance the polarization effects, and therefore build the anti-Western propaganda and spread this propaganda in order to shake the credibility and undermine the credibility of the Western actors like European Union and United States. And obviously they are subverting unwanted governments, and we have seen the concrete empirical examples in case of Georgia, when the Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and further we have seen it in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, irrespective of the fact that the Western actors designed the so-called reset policy, and they were considerate of Russian interests, that they started to include also Russia economically within the international financial systems. And we know that also Europe had certain economic relations and energy relations with Russia. So economics kind of sanctions are quite commonly used by authoritarian powers. And back to, if we go several, remember certain cases, in case of Georgia and Moldova, Russia quite often used these economic sanctions, embargoing Georgian and Moldovan wines or cutting the energy supplies and so on and so forth. I would say the most critical and also the most harsh method is carrying out military actions against their neighbor states, that is doing Russia. And currently it's almost 3 months since February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine and breached all international laws and tries to change the existing world order. Restoring the empire, and Ukraine is very critical in a sense that if Russia gets Ukraine, it means that it can easily get other post-Soviet states. And again, we can be back to the history. It's quite dangerous things evolving in front of us. So while there is a theoretical and empirical account of Russian influence in the case of Georgia, there are still few studies conducted on how much China matters in Georgia, because scholars suggest different explanation regarding the role of China as a global power. We have seen that China has a little bit different instruments. I would say it keeps the low profile. It has more soft tools in order to influence internal political dynamics, and it is argued that China has partial effects on the durability of authoritarian leadership and nearly no effect on sustaining certain leaders in democracies. While we have seen that Russia is trying to support the liberal groups in Europe, for instance, in Hungary, with his relations with Prime Minister Orban, also in France with Marine Le Pen, and also later back in 2016 in the US Russian interference in the US election. So in this sense, Russia is more assertive and aggressive, unlike China. Among the channels of support, again, back to the issue of China, export dependency on China aids most authoritarian leaders to survive. However, all these effects are manifested in African countries. And here the explanation is also that domestic autocracy invite external autocratizers to sustain their regimes. During the Russian invasion in Ukraine, China was quite neutral, especially at the beginning. It criticized West for imposing sanctions on Russia, yet recognizing the territorial integrity of Ukraine and disapproving Russian aggression. Irrespective of this condemnation, China continued to boost its trade with Russia, and these are the open figures of both. We can obtain it through open sources that after the invasion, trade between Russia and China increased over 12% compared to previous year. And China imports Russian oil, gas, coal, arms, and grain. So we have not only political and military wars, but we also have this economic wars ongoing between these great powers. And this increased trade gives financial resources to Russia for subsidizing its military venture in Ukraine, right? China also engages in energy projects with Iran, Russia, and the Central Asian region. For example, Central Asia China gas pipeline, which runs through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to Xinjiang, Uighur Autonomous Region in China, and also the Galkinish pipeline in Turkmenistan is another Chinese-sponsored project for which the Chinese Development Bank provided several millions of loans, and also China National Petroleum Corporation allocated over $4 billion US dollars, right? China signed 25-year deal with Iran to increase trade by $600 billion US dollars, and this axis of authoritarian countries, global powers, intends also to recruit China's support as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to mitigate the consequences of sanctions. If we go back to history against Iran, and then we have seen China frequently joins Russia to aid other authoritarian leaders. The stark example was vetoing the resolution initiated by Western states against Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad regime to stop human rights violations during the Syrian war in 2011 and 2012. Recent fact includes China's abstention from the UN Security Resolution in support of Ukraine. Such alignment has direct effect on authoritarian survival. And China designed also the Belt and Road Initiative to subsidize investment in infrastructural projects worth of $1 trillion US dollars to make economic and energy inroads in different geographic areas from Asia to Europe. With regards to China's role as an autocracy promoter in Georgia, it is hard for me, and I would say for any scholar, to draw any conclusions for now, given China focuses on two aspects. These are making investments and developing economic projects. For now, it is difficult to assess for what geopolitical implications it may have, although what we can assume is that it will perhaps increase the survival of incumbent governments because it brings investments, it boosts somehow economy, and obviously this also gives performance legitimacy to the incumbent governments. Since the declaration of independence, China established diplomatic ties with Georgia. However, economic and cultural ties have been evolving since 2010, and in 2017, Georgia and China signed the Free Economic Trade Agreement, which can reduce Georgia's dependence on the Russian market. And moreover, for now, China, according to the statistics, is the third largest trade partner in Georgia. According to the agreement, the free agreement with China, the Georgia might not have the export tariffs, that these export tariffs would be removed. In 2007, let me speak also about some projects that are funded by China in Georgia. In 2007, the Hualien Group, for instance, made $5 million investments in different projects. China also entered the financial sector, and in 2012, it bought control share of one of the biggest banks in Georgia. Chinese technological companies also operating at the telecommunication market of Georgia. And these are mainly economic activities. So another part of China's involvement in Georgia is limited to academic exchanges, also establishing education programs, cultural centers, and associations at different Georgian universities. This is kind of building people-to-people linkages and using mainly economic ties. Georgia, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Turkey are important states in the chain of the Belt and Road Initiative for China. And if we go from analyzing the involvement of authoritarian actors in Georgia, I would say that for now, in relation with democracy promoters, we are expecting the EU candidate status and hoping for consolidating democracy through European conditionality, because it formalizes our relations with the European Union, and it also puts better leverage to political actors and especially to the government to be more consistent in its democratic policies, and also to be more susceptible and vulnerable towards the external democratizing pressures, especially when such dynamics, quite unpredictable dynamics, unfolds in the region. We are also hoping for the accelerated NATO membership to protect the state from the existential threat that comes from Russia. And here I would say that joining European Union we understand that the candidate status is not per se joining the European Union, but it obviously will positively affect the political processes in the country and give more incentives to domestic elites, and also increases the competitive edge of external democracy promoters. And we hope that the same will be the case with regards to NATO, because it provides the security and all to the state. And without security and without statehood, we can't really speak about democracy. And we hope that the European and NATO decision makers and leaders understand this, because quite often pro-Russian groups and pro-Russian forces are using this rhetoric in order to undermine their credibility. So this is a very brief description of what is happening in Georgia for now. And I'm really, really open to your further questions to answer it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your input. I already noted down some of the questions and looking forward for asking them. And now we can move on to discussing Russia and China as an alliance. Are we seeing this? Are we going back in the, let's say, Cold War period when we had very clear West and the East, and what is this kind of alliance that is shaping right now? So, axis of authoritarianism. Are we seeing that, and what influence it has in Central and Eastern Europe specifically?
Great, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here today and talk to you about this topic. So I will be focusing on Russia and China's involvement in Central and Eastern Europe, and I will be focusing on three key questions today. So the first one that I will be looking at is what are some of the implications of Russia's support for far-right parties and movements in Central and Eastern Europe, and I will be looking at this from both sort of Russia's perspective or implication, but also the ones of European countries. And I'll take one main example, which is Hungary, and then I'll look into very briefly another one, which is Greece. Then I'll be asking the question of are there any potential conflicts between China and Russia given China's involvement in Eastern Europe over the past 10 years. And we look at mostly economic involvement. And the third question, which I'll really deal with briefly because my colleague here is going to talk about it more, is what can the EU do about this increasing expansion of interest and power of Russia and China? So I'll just very briefly mention something that Zarina also pointed out, the fact that Russia's support for the far-right parties does not concern exclusively Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe. And perhaps one of the most recent examples of that, and Zarina pointed this out, is the case of the National Rally in France with Marine Le Pen, who was in the final round of the presidential elections this year. And we found out, I mean, French people already knew, but perhaps at the international level, we found out that Le Pen was receiving financial support from an obscure small Russian bank with Kremlin liaisons. So I'm going to say this already. In most cases, it's quite difficult to point out the connections between Russia and the far right because it's not done in the most explicit manner, obviously. So oftentimes you see these kind of subversive small financial institutions that provide the support. So this will not be something that's quite easy to prove or draw the link in most cases, but I will focus on an example that I think is probably the clearest at the European level. So why is Russia supporting far-right parties and movements? One of the main, there are multiple reasons, but I will mention perhaps 2 or 3 specifically. One of them is to build alliances that advance Russia's interests in Europe and that promote support for Putin's regime and ensure ideological alignment. This is important under any circumstance, but it's particularly important when Russia's interests are opposite to those of the European Union, as we see in the current crisis with Ukraine. And I will go more into kind of the details and specifics of that with the Hungarian example in a moment. The second reason why Russia is supporting far-right movements and parties is to undermine the Western liberal system from within the European Union, through the European Union to a certain extent, and then to promote its own political positions, which are mostly liberal, such as populism, ultra-nationalism, anti-migration, and homophobia. And what this ultimately does, and Zarina was pointing at this, is to destabilize the EU and to create a dent in the way that the EU is adopting its decisions. Again, we see this with the Ukrainian crisis, and what ultimately this means at the international level is a weaker EU, perceived weaker EU, which ultimately favors Russia and other authoritarian states. So what is the far right gaining from all of this? Several things. One of them is a model based on which they can mold their policies and decision-making processes and essentially justify their existence. Russia is also culturally close to Eastern Europe and Europe in general, so geographically and culturally as well, so that kind of makes the process easier for Russia. Then also the far-right parties are also gaining access to financial resources, which, as we kind of saw in the case of France, is not always is quite limited at their national country level. So that's very important. And the final thing that they're gaining is a bargaining chip within the EU. They can easily turn to the European Union and say, well, we have an alternative in Russia. We are not dependent on you. We have other possibilities for gaining finance and support. So I mentioned the example already. We're going to be focusing on Hungary as a case study because I think this is perhaps the easiest link to be drawn between Russia and a far-right party / movement. So in Hungary's case, we see quite a shifting stance in regards to Russia. So originally, during his second term as prime minister, Orban was quite against Putin and his policies. During the invasion of Georgia in 2008, actually Orban criticized the invasion as an imperialistic action of pure power politics. However, this shifted after the 2008 financial crisis under the guidance of the director of the National Hungarian Bank, Orban, started believing that actually the financial crisis means the decline of Western powers and the rise of Eastern powers, Russia and China specifically. So what he started doing afterwards was bring closer his country to both China and Russia, and so he started conducting regular visits to the leadership of these two countries, and he launched the Eastern Opening Policy, which aimed to increase exports from Hungary to Russia and China, and this was not very successful over time, but that was the intention. Since 2008, you will not hear Orban criticizing Putin that much, and vice versa. Putin also stopped criticizing any of the actions that Orban was taking. Orban took it one step further in 2014 when in a conference in Romania, he said that Hungary was becoming a neoliberal democracy and had as its models Russia, China, and Turkey for its policies. And during his speech, he essentially opposed the Western model of liberal democracy to that of an Eastern model, which was based on very strong leadership, weak balances, and weak opposition at the same time. So essentially, the way that he's constructed his vision of democracy would be not based on the individuals in a collective, but rather on a nation vision. So in his particular case, the Hungarian nation, which needs a strong leadership to create a new form of government that leads it to become competitive and successful at the international level. So, of course, this did not sit well with the European institutions and the European Union, which started more amply criticizing Hungary for its decisions, which also kind of led Hungary to further rely on Russia as a less confrontational alternative and to essentially build more partnerships and support between the two countries. So, to give you specific examples of how this support or alliance functions, we see that Hungary has signed an agreement with Rosatom, which is the nuclear agency of Russia, to expand and renovate the nuclear power plant at Pach. And this is a 12 billion euro project, which is mostly financed through Russian loans, which means ultimately Hungary still has to pay, so it's not that much of an economic success in some ways. And ultimately what this does is actually increase Hungary's dependency energetically on Russia rather than diminish it. Orban also signed in 2021 an oil deal with Russia to provide it less expensive oil from the country. But actually, although the agreement has not been released to the public, it's actually believed that he's essentially obtaining the same average price as other European countries. So not much there. But for Orban, what's important about Russia is, or its partnership with Russia, is that it provides it a bargaining chip at the European level. So he enjoys the ability to power play between the EU and Russia. At least that's how he perceives it. The ultimate winner, even financially but beyond, is Russia. So with the Hungarian support, what Russia gains is legitimacy and a space for other far-right parties in Europe to rise and to also look up to Russia. More concretely, recently, it's also gained a lot of support from Hungary at the European level when it comes to defending its interests. As we recently saw, Hungary was very actively opposing the ban on oil, on Russian oil at the EU level, and even obtained a specific deal for itself. And it also overall stalled the process of the EU and allowed other countries to join its position. Also in the overall kind of narrative of the Ukrainian crisis, Hungary has not been very supportive of Ukraine. It's banned the transport of weapons to Ukraine through its territory and has been actively opposing the integration of Ukraine in NATO and the EU. So I told you I'll mention very quickly another example. This is quite briefly, because again, I think beyond Hungary and a few other countries, it's very difficult to prove the same level of connection between Russia and far-right parties. But in Greece, there's a new party called the Greek Solution, which is in some ways considered the successor of the Golden Dawn party. It now has 10 seats in parliament and 1 seat in the European Parliament. And it's alleged and assumed that the party is being financed by Kremlin, but its leader, Kyriakos Velopoulos, continuously denies that. However, he's very staunchly pro-Russian, and he always says that the solution for Greece is to enhance its collaboration with Putin's Russia and to move closer to Orthodox Russia based on kind of cultural/religious proximities. So now we're shifting to China. There's another authoritarian power eyeing Eastern Europe. Why not? It has two, I'm going to focus a little bit on economic things and very briefly about China too. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially an infrastructure building project that China's launched in 2012, 2013, and it doesn't concern just Eastern Europe, but it also covers Eastern Europe. And then the 16+1 initiative, which is a broader collaboration trade kind of initiative on China's part. So China's been trying to break into Eastern Europe for the past 10 years, and we already see a growing disillusionment towards the country because a lot of the promises that were made initially have not been kept. So there was a lot of promise of accession to the Chinese market for goods from Eastern Europe, and there was also a lot of promise of investment, but in the end, only 3% of the total Chinese investments in Europe have gone to Eastern Europe. So yeah, this has not been very positive for countries in the region. The main beneficiaries continue to be autocratic regimes, so Hungary and Poland. And with Hungary, there's the initiative of the Budapest-Belgrade high-speed train that's being initiated. The construction started in 2020 and it's expected to finish in 2025. It's mostly financed through Chinese loans, so again, ultimately benefits China more than anyone else. And then when it comes to Poland, it's become, in 2020, the third largest recipient of support from China after Germany and France. And this year, right before the Beijing Olympics, they decided to further expand their partnership. And there's a suggestion of possibly making Poland a logistics hub for China. So China, again, benefits from these initiatives because a lot of, first of all, it's funding most of this through loans, and then it's deploying its own companies to build these kind of projects. So this is very good. And also, just like Russia, it's essentially dividing the European Union into regions as well, especially by creating the 16+1 bloc. Lithuania actually withdrew. It used to be 17+1, but Lithuania said that we should be looking at a more broader EU-based initiative rather than a very specific regional one. Interesting point. So can we anticipate any tensions between Russia and China in Eastern Europe? I would broadly say no. Definitely we can go into more details about it, but first of all, China doesn't necessarily have that much leverage when it comes to Eastern Europe. We already saw that there's a lot of disillusionment. It has some key partners, but that's pretty much it. So unless we see a very drastic way in the way that China constructs its kind of policies towards Central and Eastern Europe, I don't think we'll see a lot of changes in the sense. They also have not entirely, but mostly different economic focuses. Russia is focused on energy support for a lot of countries, and then China at the moment is focusing on infrastructure building. And they've recently deepened their own partnership also right before the Beijing Olympics to kind of strengthen the relation between China and Russia, and they've essentially established a no-limits partnership in a variety of sectors. So ultimately, China will favor and will prefer, and Russia is the same, their partnership over any interest in Eastern Europe, especially given China's huge energy interests at the moment, and also the need for support when it comes to Taiwan. I mentioned briefly that China perhaps might have more appeal to specific countries that would not be interested in collaborating with Russia, such as Poland, because of very substantial historical reasons. So maybe in some ways they're balancing each other and supporting their kind of autocratic expansion in the region. And then they have one big common goal, which is to divide the European Union and ensure their own interests. So they ultimately, through this kind of involvement in Central and Eastern Europe, they ensure that the EU is relatively weak and inefficient, and that allows them to kind of shift the global power to a certain extent towards the East. So what does that mean for the EU? Well, we can see that there's a kind of a strategic effort to undermine the EU in Central and Eastern Europe, but the EU is aware, so this is nothing new. The EU has already mentioned that the involvement of these countries with Central and Eastern European countries with China, specifically referencing the 16+1 initiative, is a Trojan horse for the Union, and it's also called previously China a systemic threat in Eastern Europe. So what could the EU do? I'm going to mention this super briefly because Theo's going to definitely go more in depth on this. I think the EU started in the beginning with a very unsure response, which ultimately led to a situation like Hungary from develop. But I think the response is now shifting a little bit. We saw the conditionality mechanism being introduced to kind of ensure that countries receiving EU funds are putting them to good use and respecting the rule of law rather than breaking it. There is a question about keeping the unanimity decision-making process at the council level, given the impact that it has, and especially sensitive policy areas where it applies. We can see how this has blocked the decision-making process in the current Ukrainian crisis. And then I would say the EU should focus on providing more alternatives economically for Central and Eastern European countries, so that they don't choose to move towards Russia and China and other external actors, but choose to look inwards. And on the long term, I mean, this is a general thing, but still worth mentioning, we need to understand why people end up choosing far-right parties and movements, and how we can perhaps tackle the root causes. We have a lot of EU centers across Europe. Can we use those better to advance EU principles and values in these countries? So that's me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a pretty comprehensive input. From here, before we move on to the questions, and we definitely will have quite some time for questions, and I'm sure that there will be some questions from the audience as well, and I noted down also some. We can move on to Anton. I hope you're with us and you're here as well. To tell us a bit more about your organization, Free Hong Kong Center in Kyiv. Well, first of all, why was there need of this kind of organization, and how this process happened of it creating, and what are the main things that the organization is doing? And after that, maybe briefly talking if China, what from your perspective, what is interest of China in this region, and what we can, especially, I mean, young people in this region can do to counterweight these authoritarian tendencies, which are getting stronger and stronger year by year. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Kind of happy to be here, and I'm kind of sorry that my being here is right now from the online, but because of the health questions, I wasn't able to be personal. If we talk about the Free Hong Kong Center that was created by my organization, which is Liberal Democracy, and the motivation of the project was the start of the protests in Hong Kong, start of the revolution of umbrella, and the connections between Ukrainian and Hong Kong protests that we saw. And the point of the connection was that Hong Kongers who participated in the protests, they used Ukrainian context as whole Free Alliance countries, I can guess. They came to the barricades with Ukrainian flags. They used our slogans like "Glory to Ukraine." They rechanged to "Glory to Hong Kong," and also they motivated their fight against communistic regime with the examples of the successful fight Ukrainian protesters against the regime of our dictator, ex-dictator Yanukovych. So this example was kind of interesting because we also saw that protests in Hong Kong started anti-Ukrainian narrative in the Chinese propaganda. We should understand that as Free Hong Kong Center, we mentioned some moments of Chinese policy in Ukraine. And that's not only about economical moments, but also about some information events. For example, all these years from the 2014, before 2012, there was no Ukrainian language of official, unofficial Chinese web pages. There was no Ukrainian language in official Chinese newspapers, etc. However, China even talked about Ukrainian instructors in organization of protests in Hong Kong, Ukrainian instructors for the information company against Chinese People Republic and Communist Party. And this narrative was kind of same with Russia. Also point that Russia and China, they together supported pro-Russian television and pro-Russian media, and also Russian oligarchs in Ukraine. For example, Vitor Medvedchuk and his channel 112 always was talk about that we should give more attention to Chinese proposition, that we should more collaborate and work with China, etc. Also, history with Crimea for Chinese people and for the Chinese government was quite similar and quite same with the question of Taiwan. So when they spoke about the annexation Crimea, they saw that Russia is right in this question, just because that's kind of the same with Taiwan. So the point is that our center, what we did exactly, all this time from the whole beginning of our project, we protested and spoke about Chinese influence in propaganda and Chinese collaboration with Russian Federation. Also, we helped our friends in Hong Kong because we know personally leaders of the protests. So we know personally people who participated in also protest of Uyghurs in Tibetans. Sometimes these guys needed help. And also, there was quite important from the side of Liberal Democratic League to speak about rights of Uyghurs and Hong Kongers and Tibetans and other minorities, not minorities, but indigenous nations who live in China, and how China breaking their human rights. So we did it. And now, as Free Hong Kong Center, we see that actually Chinese policy didn't change. China, from the beginning of Russian aggression in 2014, actually supported Russia. That's not kind of natural position. For sure that they didn't help military way. For sure they didn't vote for Russian position as voted Eritrea, for example, or Belarus or Armenia. But they were neutral. They spread narratives about responsibility of the West for the war in Ukraine and about inside conflict in Ukraine, that Ukrainians kill themselves. And also they spread narratives that we can't complain Ukraine and Taiwan question, and also we can't build a system of defense as in the times of the Cold War. Also, they still thought about Ukraine as a part of the sphere of influence of Russian Federation. That's visibly see if we will see that, for example, Chinese ambassador in Kyiv, that's ex-ambassador of Chinese People Republic in Moscow. Whole embassies, they always spoke Russian, etc. Just because China didn't mention Ukraine as an object of international relationships, just as a part of the sphere of Russia. And that's actually picture of the world that Russia very, very wanted to see. We should right now understand that for China, that's very important that Putin regime will stay, just because that's about predictable partner, just that's about visible perspective for the next years. And also that's about non-separatism fictions in the Chinese People Republic. So which conclusions like we can head from that? Because you asked about what we can do as young people. I guess that as young people in Europe who staying for some liberal values, some United Europe values, we should objectively say that as a West we failed. As a West we failed because all these years we didn't speak enough about Russian aggression, and we didn't speak about crimes the Chinese regime do. I speak right now about crimes in East Turkestan. I speak right now about crimes in Hong Kong and also about Tibet. And that's the best time and the best way to take responsibility for these actions. That's actually finally start to speak about all these things. That's actually start to speak that guys in 21st century, in 2022, we have very big problems with authoritarian regimes who are actually killing people, who built concentration camp in Ukraine right now in Mariupol, the filtration camps created by Russia, and in Turkestan that's created by China. That we should not ask but push our governments to stop collaborate with these countries and to take the human rights for the first place. Just because if we will still close eyes for the crimes of Chinese regime right now, that will mean that we will never win in Ukrainian-Russian war. Just because like that's pretty connected cases, and we should understand that all not accepted sanctions or not accepted actions against Russia, that's a visible message for China that they can and they have ability to continue their crimes, and that will be no responsibility for their actions, as Russia right now have actually no responsibility for what they do because sanctions are not enough. Also, that's very, very important to spread information about collaborations of China and Russia in the military context. That was like all their like history from the beginning of Russian participations in some war. For example, that they together participated in this Syria company. I'm speaking about not like literally participating, but that Russia did some actions for the Chinese interests in Syria, like bombing offices of Uyghurs, for example, in 2015. Also, they together supported junta in Myanmar. Also, they together supported dictatorship regimes in Africa to contraband the gold, etc. So actually, the consequence, not the consequence, but generally that looks like China spread some economical interests by use hands by Russia. So if we will stop Russia, China will not have such successful, such useful instrument to economical consumption to spread their expansive to the Middle East, to the Africa, to the Eastern Europe countries like Serbia, like Moldova, like Georgia. Yeah, that's where I am right now.
Thank you very much for your input. And yeah, for now we mostly talked about the let's say the other side, the authoritarian, something like an alliance, and the authoritarian part of international order. So maybe it's time to move on to the other sides. And well, first of all, if we are living in the time where we have the sides, maybe it's something to very briefly touch. Are we living in a world where we are shaping these two sides? Is it already shaped, or it's in a process? And are we moving on from unipolar world? Are we moving on to multipolar world? Or even we will have only two sides, and if this is something that will be decisive in the upcoming future. So maybe on that, but also the main issue is that what the let's say the collective West or the European Union mainly should do to counterweight this trend of rising authoritarianism, and to counterweight, well, within the union, because well, Poland and Hungary are part of the union, and they are blocking with their membership a lot of things, including the recent one, like for example the embargo on Russian gas and oil. The Hungary blocked it, and so what European Union should do to counterweight this rise of authoritarian tendencies within the EU, but mostly in the Eastern European countries which are not part of the EU but are either on the way of becoming the EU or have this kind of aspiration. So to hear some more European perspective, let's say like that. Theo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgi. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. My name is Theo Comet. I'm coordinating TILT. It's a digital campaign platform affiliated with the European Green Party. I'm not here today to talk about TILT because I was invited by Georgi to speak about EU as a counterweight of authoritarian tendencies in Eastern Europe. Maybe a couple of words about myself. It's a big pleasure to be here, hosted by Protest and by CDN, and I was kind of Georgi's predecessor. I was not a network coordinator, but office coordinator of CDN for a few years. And it's always great to be back and see old friends and new faces. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm also a board member of the Green European Foundation, as was said earlier. But I'm not going to speak on behalf of the European Greens or on behalf of Jeff, but more kind of as a green person who has been quite involved in green politics in different parts of Europe, including in Eastern Europe. And I would like to start with a little bit of a reflection on something that you said in the beginning in your opening speech, Georgi. You said that there is a world order with the name to create peace, and then you also said that there is barbarism. And now we were talking about this as the authoritarians and what is on the other side. So I'm curious, what is on the other side? What is this world order that supposedly has a name to create peace? I'm from Finland myself, Helsinki, Finland. We have now we have had a quite interesting discussion about joining NATO. And now there is some complications around that that you might have heard about with Turkey and Finland's accession to NATO. And it has made us reflect a lot on what it means to go into a military alliance. If we're talking about the world order, and then we can also talk about the regional order after that, with countries like the United States that have pursued their own imperialistic goals with military means in last years, and these crimes have been documented, and there has not been accountability for many of them. Countries like Turkey, which is now demanding the extradition of Kurdish people from Sweden and Finland as a concession. It's a very complicated situation when we also don't really understand exactly what the Turkish government wants. And we are in a situation, just to maybe put us out from the mindset for a second, that I think I tend to have quite often, especially with the war of aggression and the attempt of a full-scale invasion that started on the 24th of February, that there are also other dynamics that are really difficult to put into our categories. For example, now if we agree that the US are the good guys this time, and we have not only to confront but to actively work against the capacity of the Russian Federation to carry out what they are carrying out in different ways, both in Ukraine and elsewhere. We also need to take into account that, for example, yesterday there was in the news that it was a Reuters article. They are quoting someone from the Syrian Democratic Forces, so mostly Kurdish, led by the People's Protection Units, YPG, in Syria, who are now preparing for a military offensive, a fourth one, last year from Turkey. And they say that they are going to work, so they are backed by Americans, and they are going to work together with the Syrian government, with Assad, on air defense. So we are now in a situation when we are focusing a lot on diminishing Russia's role, or the Russian Federation's role, but at the same time, there is a NATO country that is working together with a government backed by the Russian Federation against another NATO country. And there are a lot of contradictions going on these days, and I think it's important that we also try to put ourselves a bit out from our own context and see a little bit what these different actors are pursuing around in the world. There is also, of course, inside of the European Union, a lot of contradictions. When we're talking about what should the EU do, the EU is its member states. We have member states, like was mentioned already, in very interesting ways, what Hungary is doing and what Poland is doing. The fact that a person who had election flyers with a picture of Vladimir Putin and then had to destroy them got into the second round and got even more votes than last time. So when the French people had to choose between a liberal and a Putinist, it was quite close. And France is one of these two, let's say, one of the big two motors in the European Union together with Germany. We have Italy, where a month ago Sergei Lavrov was on TV, on a TV station owned by a company of Silvio Berlusconi, former prime minister, saying that they are carrying out denazification, and then the journalist asked, yeah, but Zelensky is Jewish, and then Lavrov said, yeah, but Hitler also had Jewish blood. You remember this thing? This is happening on a TV station. For 42 minutes, Sergei Lavrov was talking on Italian TV, owned by a former prime minister who might be whose party might be a part of the next government, together with, for example, Matteo Salvini, returning perhaps to the government in Italy next year, who has been actively opposing military support to Ukraine, who has been opposing supporting Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So there are a lot of internal contradictions inside of the European Union. We see it also now in statistics with when citizens in different EU countries are being asked who started the war in Ukraine. In Italy, 50% of people only say that it was the Russian Federation. In countries like Bulgaria and Greece, we are closer to 25%. We have an issue in different parts of the European Union in how do people understand what is going on and what is the role of propaganda. Is it domestic propaganda? Is it propaganda coming from Russia, etc.? I would like to maybe at this point quote someone that I appreciate a lot. It's a quote that has been used quite a lot, so sorry if this is the 15th time you hear it, but there is a quote by Antonio Gramsci from Italy, founder of the Communist Party in Italy, that the old is dying, the new is not born yet, and in this interregnum we see a variety of morbid symptoms. Then we can ask ourselves a little bit, what is this old, what is this new? Me, from a Finnish perspective, for example, that is a country that is maybe geographically in the east, but is also self-identifying as a Western country. We can see that there is a kind of a sometimes slow, sometimes faster disintegration of institutions that were created after the Second World War, and that a lot of the phenomena we see around in Europe, whether it's polarization, populism, etc., can be attributed to that. We have maybe a different kind of transformation. I mean, I think that the opening session was very nicely phrased with the transformation of Eastern Europe, where we have perhaps an order that has started, let's say, from 1989, and then through different waves of different kinds of color revolutions, if that's a term that makes sense, and how do we come to 2022? And as Greens, this is quite. It's interesting to, for example, reflect on the fact that we are now in a position where we are defending institutions. We're defending this order that was created after World War II when it comes to liberal democracy, human rights instruments, and so on. We are in a position that is for us a little bit uncomfortable because we're kind of conservative. We want to protect something and to conserve something. Whereas we also have an identity where we really question institutions, like the institution of the family or the institution of the military or other institutions. But we do see these kind of different morbid symptoms, and then we need to try our best to understand what they are and what kind of agency we have for the future. And here I would like to go to a second point, which is what are we supposed to do? Not as, I mean, EU is one thing, but I mean, citizens or political activists or parties, what are we supposed to do when there is a rejection of liberal democracy, as has been outlined here in different parts of the world, including in the European Union? Do we accommodate this? Do we pretend that it doesn't exist? Which is a policy that the EU has quite successfully pursued in relation to different countries, for example, with Serbia, with Vucic now, who has announced this week that he's sending a Kurdish person to Erdogan. and it's something we have to fight for. We have to fight against. We have to make sure that people who refugees, political dissidents, that they are safe when they come to other countries. Of course, Serbia is not in the EU, but that this applies to Kurdish people, to Belarusian people. There has been very mysterious violence, and I think one assassination of Azerbaijani political opposition in EU countries in last years. So do we have a kind of a policy of accommodation, like, oh, it's Serbia? This is a little bit the core of Finlandization, that during the Cold War we pretended that Russia or the Soviet Union doesn't exist. It's none of our business. So okay, then we can also have more confrontation, which then of course comes with a lot of challenges, because we live in a world where I was listening lately to a very interesting interview with Ivan Krastev, who is a political scientist from Bulgaria, long one. And he was talking about this thing that you have countries where, he was mentioning specifically Russia, you have countries where when there are people in the streets, people don't ask themselves, why are they there? But people ask themselves, who sent them there? Like there's this kind of immediate conspiracism. Like it's weird, someone must have sent them there. Oh, it's George Soros or it's someone. I mean, so kind of being actively involved, what does that mean? And how does it not how do you call it, backlash, or or just different other varieties of indifference. And here I would like to put on the table, I mean, I didn't come here to talk about institutional programs. There are institutional programs. There is a program called Global Europe Human Rights and Democracy Program that runs part of the EU budget. It's 1.5 billion euros over 7 years, and then it's kind of election observation missions, or supporting media, or working with governments and UN and so on. But I would like to make us a little bit reflect on what else than money does that mean. Also from this interview with Krastev, and now I'm going to stop just making a list of points that he said. No, but I found it very interesting. Is that he emphasized the topic of corruption as something that has become a little bit of a narrative that explains everything. Like, we have problems in our country with infrastructure or with elections or something. Oh, it's corruption. Western analysts, when they try to understand some other countries, it's also, oh, it's corrupt, it's weird. And he kind of puts forward the question that there are also motivations for people, that is not just money. There is dignity, there is recognition, and I think that the last months have really shown that. And from a green perspective, I think that it's very important that what we do is rooted in value of autonomy, self-determination, self-defense, and that we don't expect that active intervention during a crisis, which we should do. We should support Ukraine militarily and do other things that Ukraine is needing, but that we don't expect active intervention to be their only tool or the main tool. That we are also able to foresee a little bit what is coming, and create kind of partnerships that are based on something else than an envelope of money from EU to make a project, which is something that is super nice, because that's also what like this kind of international project is also what brings us all here together. But there is also a lot of other things that we need to think about of why we do this. And maybe just to end, a couple of words about where the EU has been in the last years and where the EU might be going, because I think that's also a very interesting question. I mean, we will see now how difficult it will be to advance Ukraine's EU membership application, and there's also many other countries that have expressed an interest or are candidates. But what is this EU that these countries, hopefully, if they want, will join at some point? Europe has really tightened itself in the last. The EU has really tightened itself, or gotten much more consolidated in the last few years through different crises, through financial crisis that was devastating in Southern Europe, that broke a lot of that it took an unfortunately long time to break a lot of taboos about how to integrate Europe economically, for example, with common debt and these kind of things, which was then further integrated with the pandemic, where we also noted that health Europe had been prepared to a certain extent and was useful in the breakout of the pandemic, and that's something that we will definitely have to develop more. And now with a war that has also seen unprecedented, I would say, unprecedented capacities of EU to react effectively and not just be concerned. Keeping in mind, of course, that there are member states that are blocking the effective action that is needed, and that there are crises that we will have ahead of us. We don't really know what that might be, but for sure, the climate one is of course a very obvious one, and all of what that will entail for people in Europe and outside of Europe. We have different, I mean, now when we're talking about authoritarian tendencies, I think that it's important that we take into account that we don't really know what elections will look like in the near future. We saw an attempt in the United States, in the center of the empire that we are part of a president who lost the popular vote twice, and the second time his supporters tried to make a coup. Okay, it was maybe a little bit carnivalistic, but we have to take that seriously. There will be elections in Brazil later this year. Hopefully Bolsonaro's end will be soon, and we will see what happens in Europe as well, with different elections that are coming up in EU countries and in non-EU countries. So there are different crises that we need to prepare for in order to not have to have the direct intervention or measures during a crisis as the only tool. And this is a question that is very different from a lot of other European questions, because we're talking about, for example, I'm a Euro-federalist. I'm from a Green Party in Finland. We are very kind of pro-EU. We see EU as a political space where we solve the climate crisis, where we solve social justice-related issues, where we solve health issues, where we solve security. We want to create a European political space for that. And then the question of democracy is then different from all of these other topics that you can a little bit compartmentalize, because the question of democracy is the basis for everything. I'm sorry if I don't have a lot of answers. I'm a little bit confused, but it's great to be here to listen to the previous speakers, and also to hang out with you a little bit, because I'm very kind of deeply convinced that organizations like CDN and events like this is the place where young people and civil society figure out what they need, what they want. Do they want what they need? Do they need what they want? And it's not up to us from EU countries to figure that out, but to follow you, in the same way as we should now follow Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot. It would be surprising if we had answers on all of these questions, which we, of course, don't and cannot have. So maybe we can move on with some follow-ups and the questions based on the discussions that we had. Maybe I will open this up, and then the audience feel free to, and I will note it down, and we can ask the questions either to all of the speakers or specifically, or to follow up on their input. So the question I have, and this is something that I think it is impossible not to talk about while we talk about global powers and Eastern Europe, and not to talk about candidate status and European Union and Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia wanting to join the European Union, and at the same time a long process of the Western Balkan countries trying to join in the European Union. And I think it is important that recently there was a poll from Serbia, who has been trying to join the European Union for a long time already. The first time ever in the polling, we saw that more than 50% of the people, I mean, those who were asked, say that they do not want to join the European Union. The reasons are very large, but one of the reasons could be this very long waiting time, and this is something to definitely have in mind. And this would be my question to Zarina, if she could share her opinion on the upcoming candidate status of Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, and what would be the best response on this from the European Union side, because, well, of course, we know that we have problems, but in both of our countries, especially coming from, for example, me myself, Georgia. Georgia has been backsliding on democracy recently, and this candidate status at the same time could be also some kind of a support to the current government, which has been not very democratic. But at the same time, yeah, what are the implications, the complications of this candidate status, and what would be the best response on this?
Thank you, Georgi. Thank you. This is a very interesting question, but let me also give some comments about Tao's really interesting speech. He mentioned about EU, that European Union was not just was concerned, and he expects more activities and more involvement from the EU side. But here, let me remind that to the people like Georgian citizens who live in Georgia and watching what EU does in response to the Ukrainian war, we were a little bit surprised because such a huge institution was quite effective in responding not only with political remarks, but also giving a specific, designing the specific policies, including supporting the member states to meet the needs for refugees, supporting the Ukrainian refugees, also giving the financial assistance program, sanctioning Russian individuals and also Russian financial institutions. And this is quite difficult to put within 15 hours after the invasion, and also continue to be consistent in this regard, because European Union is the alliance of the different countries, and this means that these different countries also are not monolithic, they also are fragmented, and they have the interest, and the process of accommodation of this interest and building consensus is quite difficult and timely process, but we have seen that the European Union did it perfectly, and we hope that European Union will be consistent in this regard. Another point that also Teo mentioned about Turkey, that in Finland it's quite difficult to understand what a president or Erdogan wants from Finland. But let me remind you to how the year of 2008, before 2008, when there was a Bucharest summit, we also in Georgia struggled to understand what Germany wanted from Georgia or Ukraine when they did not give us membership action plan. Also, Georgia was the first contributor to NATO alliance and participated in all missions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, a non-member partner country which contributed so much. And in terms of military reforms, Georgia really built and advanced and created the strong military institutions under the civilian control. Of course, we can argue about the quality of democracy during that time, and even now, as Georgi mentioned, that Georgia goes back and forth in this process, but it's we all know that the democratization is the process, and it's not a static only having the one point where you are either liberal democracy or you stand only on the one score. Even within the European Union, as we mentioned here, the Hungary has its problems, and for now, Hungary, if you look at freedom measures or Freedom House measures, it barely qualifies to the consolidated democracy, right? And we also, if we go to other countries like NATO members, Albania, or even Turkey, as mentioned, they are not purely consolidated democracies. Contrary, they are authoritarian. But we all understand that NATO is more military security alliance, and it sometimes lowers the bar and threshold for the quality of political regime. And we also need to understand that this time is quite uncertain times. It's quite, we are in the crisis, we are in the war, in the center of the European Union. And in this case, traditional formulas could not work. And we all agree we need to be effective in our response, and transatlantic unity is crucial and essential to win this war together. So history is really bad. While Russia says to denazify Ukraine, Russia itself needs to be denazified, because there is the consolidated authoritarian regime, there is a dictator which jails and kills opposition leaders, controls the media, also somehow uses the military and other resources in order to achieve its political ends, and it's quite dangerous, and invades the country which is a sovereign state and recognized by all international subjects of international law, and it's subverts democratically elected government and goes against the will of majority, which is the cornerstone of democratic principles. So we see absolute violation, and they even don't hide their intent to eliminate Ukraine as a nation and as a state. And this is quite alarming process, what is unfolding in our eyes, and we could not be so indifferent and only putting and shifting the blames, or saying that, you know, some democratic countries might be also use authoritarian tools. Of course, they can use, because sometimes liberal order is maintained with real politics, and we also have the data standards. Remember, again, go back to the membership action plan. We also struggled why Germany did not give us membership action plan together with Ukraine, because we might have avoided these processes and conflicts and prevent it, right? So this is quite, I would say that was a strategic mistake, and I hope in a way the Western actors, collective West, will stand together and be quite firm in response to Russia. And now go back to status of candidate for EU membership. I agree absolutely that there is a trend towards backslide, democratic trend of democratic backsliding. We have seen the opposition leaders sometimes are tried on the politically motivated basis. We have seen that the media is repressed. If you remember these illiberal groups which are supported by Russia, for instance, one of the famous businessmen, Levan Vasadze, who earned his fortune in Russia and comes and preaches the conservative values and also illiberal values, and tries to mobilize the conservative part of society and radicalize the youth in order to advance its political intentions, and meets the far-right ideologist of Russia, Dugin, and then Dugin reshares all these bank accounts to really financial support to the far-right media and far-right groups. And quite 30 minutes ago, there was published a decision, court decision in Georgia, that Altinfo, which is the illiberal media and funded by the Russian, linked to Russia, it was fined by the audit office and the court in Georgia for illegally obtaining revenues worth to almost 300,000 Georgian lari. So this means that there is some dark money, dark funds, shadow fundings of these organizations. Going back to the status of candidate, yes, I believe European Union should give Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova the status of candidate, because this strengthens the European credibility. This gives more leverage to European Union to prepare to leverage the decisions of the political elites in Georgia. And we are having upcoming parliamentary elections almost within 2 years. And so this could serve as a second time when, for the second time, we can, through elections, vote out the government which the majority disapproves. And we can also mobilize resources and adopt more democratic policies and consolidate our democracy. So this is not me who says it, but if we go to the literature of Europeanization, starting from Professor Vachudova, Professor Cherepenko, and other scholars, they all convincingly argue that when you have more formalized rules, when you have the membership perspective, when you have the conditionality instrument, then the democratic processes are better accelerated because you can hold responsible veto authoritarian actors and their decisions. So please, again, let me repeat one thing, that traditional formulas won't work today, and we need somehow to integrate these countries not only in European Union and not only also in NATO to protect the European security, and if we really want to build democracy in this region. So I don't think that the Ukraine, there should be any discussions now that Ukraine should take candidate status or not. Ukraine does not fight only for Ukrainian people, but for European security as well. And I hope that the European decision makers and people are understanding this quite well. It's easy to sit in European capitals and in European cities and observe this, but I am here in Tbilisi where I see Ukrainian refugees and I see on the daily basis what happens in Ukraine, and also Ukrainian people who are experiencing these horrible war crimes and horrible traumatic experiences. So they definitely deserve, and we do so because we also experienced war and we adopted democratic policies. We have our drawbacks, but exactly the conditionality and the status of candidate is important to improve and to work on the shortcomings what our political regime has, to improve its quality and to make Georgia a better democracy.
Thank you very much for this point, and I will ask another question, follow up on that, and then maybe we can open for the audience. And yeah, we mentioned several times that traditional formulas doesn't work, and we're living in a time when the old is dying and the new is not born yet. So, and reflecting on, I mean, we are coming. Most of the people in this audience are coming from the Green family. We are Green political family, and we are rooted in peace movement, and we are rooted in going and being against establishment and being against this also critically reflecting on the West as such. And when I said the peace project, of course, West as such today, or especially in the past, is not really a peace project, but we want it to be. And I think that is something that is possible in difference with Russia and China, where there is no other political groups, or it's not really possible for them to become if there is no big tectonic changes. While in, let's say, collective West, there's a more possibility that with more Greens in the governments, and with more Greens in the parliaments, and with more changing the society as such and evolving it, there's a possibility that the West can become a peace project. But of course, like, there's Iraqi war, there's Afghanistan, there's all the things are there, and we should not hide it, and we should not just put it aside, and we should be very open to criticize the West for its actions, for how it managed to depend on Russian gas and oil in time of after what Russia has already done in some countries after the collapse of Soviet Union, be that in Georgia or before that in Chechnya, and continue to do very bad policies which could have been avoidable it was not something that it's something that could have been avoided. So the question is, how do we, as the Greens, can position in these changing times, especially focusing on the West as such, which we have to criticize, but how do we do that as of now when we have these so to say these two sides, and at the same time like discussion on the NATO, which we have to criticize. I mean, NATO has done not very good things in the past and very bad military campaigns which caused a destruction, but the Greens were one of the, well, in many countries Greens were founded again as a party against the NATO and against the putting military bases of the NATO in the countries, but we are clearly seeing that has changed a lot. In 2022, in many countries, Greens are seen as the most pro-NATO and the most most proactive in supporting Ukraine and in going most harsh against this authoritarian, let's say, brotherhood of China and Russia. The Greens are the most vocal and most supportive of democratic forces. So how do we at the same time remain close to our values and close to manage to criticize what is to be criticized in the West, but at the same time, how do we balance that? We don't decrease the leverage and we don't discredit something that we are part of and then we want it to change. Maybe it's to Raluca and Theo, maybe you could give us your input on that if you have something in mind.
Okay, thanks. A lot of very interesting questions. I took some notes, and there's a lot now on the table, so I'm not going to address all of it. But just very brief point. I don't want to go into this. What about US or something? But when we're talking about support of the far right in Europe, it's clear that a lot of the structural support, a lot of the propaganda. Clearly, most of it is coming from the Russian Federation, from state resources that are being used to disrupt elections and other democratic decision-making processes. But we also see that there is this is not the only source of conservative or ultra-conservative influence in the EU. We see, for example, on a global level, the growth and growing influence of the evangelicals. Christian evangelicals in the United States, where we have seen very concretely what that means in terms of people access to fundamental rights, for example, right to abortion. In Brazil, where they are close to Bolsonaro, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Korea, and so on. And we see that there is also in Europe attempts to influence. When there was a referendum in Ireland about abortion, Facebook, for the first time, I think, they blocked the ads that were paid from foreign countries because there was so much American money coming to support conservatives on that question, and you know they repealed the eighth and everything, and it could have gone the other way if American conservatives had gotten their way. But anyway, and this is not a way for me to say like what about US, but just that the source of ultra-conservatism is not only coming from the East, but from the East it's most of it, and it's coming with state resources, which is a big difference also. I mean, yeah, the questions of what waiting times entering EU, the questions of okay. So for the last few months, I have been very, very frustrated, as probably a lot of other people, with the inability of certain leftists or self-proclaimed leftists to make a distinction between United States and Russian Federation. Russian Federation is an authoritarian, imperialist kleptocracy, and United States is a democratic imperialist kleptocracy. There is a big difference. You can fight against the imperialism and the kleptocracy in the United States. It's not a perfectly functioning democracy. We see how they are gerrymandering and so on, and indeed how they had a president who lost the popular vote. But it's an important distinction. And in that sense, we also have distinctions between, for example, two leaders who seem to be rather close, even though historically these two countries have strategic rivalry in the Black Sea, Caucasus, Balkans, which is Russian Federation and Turkey. where Erdogan and Putin seem to have been getting along for different reasons in the last years, but there is a huge difference, which is that Turkey still has multi-party elections. They have a very high threshold, 10% to get in. Last time, when they voted in local elections, 2019 was a very interesting year in terms of local politics in Eastern Europe. It was the year when we got a green mayor in Budapest. It was the year when in big cities in Turkey they voted for the opposition. In Istanbul they had to vote twice. It was the year when in Moscow there was a smart voting where the systemic opposition joined Navalny, so KPRF and some other actors there to not take over the Moscow City Council, but at least to create a bigger minority group than it was before. And a year later we saw what happened to Navalny. So in that sense, we need to figure out how we can support multi-party democracy. This might sound like really bland or just like, yeah, of course, like participation, democracy. But I think that one thing that is very interesting to notice is how now when we were at the Council of the European Greens this week, maybe some of you were there was for the first time a prime minister of a country from a Green party, from Montenegro. There is a clear kind of movement in Southeastern Europe, in Croatia, in Serbia, in Montenegro, to create progressive alternatives, green, anti-corruption, and I think that it's very important when it comes to countries that are about that have an intention to join the EU or are about to do it, to really strengthen this part of the political system, because it would be very complicated now to have Serbia enter the EU. Just looking at what Hungary is doing with their veto, even if we didn't have a veto, or what would Turkey be if it entered the EU with the current government? So I would say that organizing events like this and especially kind of working together on how can we do activism, whatever that means to us in our lives, be it kind of more informal activism or more structured NGO activism, or maybe some people are academic activists. We also need to think about elections and to contesting power, to learn from election campaigning, what works, what doesn't work, in order to keep this kind of multi-party democracy alive. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
I mean, I'll add perhaps a different viewpoint in a certain way, but I mean, ultimately I agree with Theo. I think we live in a very complex world, and especially in times of crises, I think it's easier for the human mind to process an easier version, which would be black and white, good and bad. And so I think in this particular crisis, you know, Russia, bad, Ukraine and the Western world, good. And I think what Theo is quite importantly bringing into kind of focus is the fact that we have our own problems in the Western world with the US, and not just the US, Europe as well, that we have to still consider and focus on. It can't just be about polarizing and antagonizing Russia and then not focusing on our sort of internal problems as well. So I think in this sense, it's a very important point to take into account. The only way we can be strong is to recognize that we have weaknesses and deal with them strategically. So I think in my presentation, I had already mentioned some of the things that we could possibly do to strengthen EU democracy at the moment. So, you know, I said perhaps eliminating the unanimity vote in the council on sensitive topics could be one of the potential solutions, but also really looking at why people support far-right movements and try to go from the grassroots level and work upwards from there.
Thanks a lot. We are very short with the time. The topic is very big and the topic is very interesting, and I think we can dedicate a 2-week seminar on just discussing this issue, which we put in 1.5 hours, which already we exceeded. So I would like our audience to ask for questions. Like we can take, I think, 2-3 questions together, and then maybe panelists answer. Then some of the panelists are here, so then we can use also some time between the sessions to maybe you can ask the questions. But yeah, so let's take the questions. Perfect. Asia, and then we'll give.
Okay, thank you. I have a question to Raluca and Teo. You mentioned far-right connection with Russia, but unfortunately, they are like Russian propaganda machine is not so stupid to deal just with one, just with far-right. But what do you see? Do you see their influence in leftist narratives in Europe, and where maybe you see this weak point, and maybe some ideas what the main message is and how maybe we can deal with that if it's relevant. Thank you.
I'm not really aware of Russian influence in leftist narratives, so maybe you can tell me more about it at some point and we can discuss about it. All right.
Yes, we can see that. There is a project of, or a platform that is affiliated with RT called Redfish, just as an example, which is very interesting. I mean, I'm not here to promote it, sorry, but yeah, don't follow it. No, but it's interesting what they try to do, because it's they have an Instagram and social media and a lot of videos, and then they are making content for leftists. So they are all the time showing when there is some protest in Latin America, and especially when there's something in US, they're showing videos and people are rising up. They're using a lot of kind of leftist aesthetics. And then sometimes they kind of, so for example, they published a map in the beginning of the now recent attempt of invasion, sorry. It was something about some statistics about war in Ukraine. It looked very leftist and cool, and then it had a map where somehow Crimea was not in Ukraine. And then a lot of leftists were sharing that. And so I think that, yeah, an interesting thing to maybe keep in mind is, like you were saying earlier, I took some, why is the Russian Federation supporting the far right in Europe? It for sure has ideological roots. I'm sure that there's people like Dugin and others who really are convinced of far right ideology, but also there is just this general kind of agent of chaos, like destabilizing and whatever. And I think that sorry, now I'm just talking a lot, and you said that we need to be short, but I think that we need to be very aware that I also identify as a leftist, that we come from sometimes a political culture or a tradition where we like to criticize things. We like to go into critique, whether it is reading a book or sitting in a bar, and we like to criticize things or ourselves or each other or whatever. And there is a kind of a clear threat that if we now just sit and criticize, we're going to block the action. And I think that this is one challenge where, and I don't want to say that this is a problem in all the left, not at all, but there is a part of the broader left, and I'm not talking now about one party family, but of the broader left, where kind of excessive criticism will de facto mean inaction. And what are the consequences of that?
Thank you. Anton also has a point.
Yeah. Actually, about Russian influence in left narratives and left organizations, like probably from the Ukrainian perspective, these narratives are kind of visible. First of all, this question of Azov battalion. I mean, like if you will check kind of leftist organizations, left users in Instagram and Facebook, there is always question: what about Azov? What about far right organizations in the Ukrainian army? What about far right narratives, etc.? So this narrative that Ukrainians is the same with neo-Nazis is like still strong, and that's one of the narratives actually which Russian and Chinese propaganda try to retranslate to the West users. This first point. The second point, that to kill people is bad from both sides, and so that Ukraine should like start dialogue, start negotiations, etc., just to stop kill people, because Russians also have harm from this war. That's actually also bad, because that's about mistaking narratives that Ukraine defending themselves, ourselves, and Russia is just aggressor and a co-parent and so responsible country for the genocide of Ukrainian nation. So there is nothing the same that is bad, like to kill Russian occupant. And the second point in left Ilia, I don't know how to say it correctly, but that they are good Russians. I mean, this narrative that we should right now also care about Russian opposition, that we should right now also care about human rights in Russia, etc., etc., that we should, I don't know, like take responsibility for the some political activists from the Russia who try to escape to the Europe. Actually, that's and that's usual people also have harm because of the sanctions. That's actually kind of one of the strongest narrative, and I'm not really sure that in West countries there is possible like to stop them, stop spreading them, just because we should understand that sanctions are work actually because they have consequences for the usual people. And also we have to understand that there is no opposition in Russia which might think will be not imperialistic, which might think will have like principal differences between Russian state positions and opposition positions, like quiet opposition. The true Russian opposition right now want to destroy their country, want their country ruin, want their country starts like separate to small republics, etc. So if Russian oppositors speak how they are about their harm, if they speak about rights of Russians, about Russophobia, etc., but they don't speak about colonizer experience of Russian Federation as a state. They don't speak about imperialism, politics, about genocides, which are like whole history of Russia. That means that these oppositions are just like part of the Russian propaganda, and that's the only one goal that they have. That they try to not take the collective responsibility for the genocide of the Ukrainian nation for the all Russian people. So this like three the most, I don't know, visible examples, I guess, like of Russian propaganda from the leftists. And I guess that we should understand that actually in the point of the war, there is not complicated world. That's actually white and black. Because right now we are in the situation where wars still continue, where everyday Ukrainians dying defending liberal values and their right to live, to stay, to choose, etc. So right now when we are in process of genocide of Ukrainian nation, we shouldn't make the context of the war more complicated than it is in reality. So that's
Cool. Thanks a lot. So now to take questions together, and then we answer together, and then we finish the session. So yes.
Hello, my name is Alexey. I'm from Belarus, and the day the day before yesterday, I heard about one of the European Green Party officials this phrase that we better buy fossils from 10 bad guys than from one bad guy. And for me, it sounds like we better start 10 aggressive wars from 10 different countries than from one country that we build fossil. So Raluca says that it's weaknesses of European politics, but is it a policy of European Union? It's all.
To the other question as well. We take it together.
Yeah, I want to continue about the problem that from our country we saw some hypocrisy of European Union, because we saw that there are two kinds of authoritarian regime which European Union admit that we have like Kazakhstan, in which regime was shot Walker Riley and didn't have any sanction at all. And we saw Azerbaijan that still good guys from European Union and still not bad as Putin, but Aliyev regime started a war with Armenia, and we so on. We can saw that European Union they have a authoritarian belt, like in Africa, in Eastern Europe, and so on and so on. There are two different, like two policy from with some authoritarian regime which like have good relation with EU, and other politic with authoritarian regime which have bad. Yeah, that is what that's my question. How to work in this situation?
Thank you. And Katya.
I have a question and a comment at the same time. Like my comment about leftist propaganda, like Russian propaganda on leftist, about also pacifism that they use usually to justify why Ukrainians shouldn't receive weapons, especially heavy weapons from European Union and NATO countries. And how maybe you can also comment it. Is it pacifism or not, or it's like what we should do with it? And yeah, I think that's all.
Yes. Yeah. We can we can start with the answers. If one of you, the speakers, have the answer, feel free to. I'm not sure if we will manage for everyone to answer because we're short with time. But yes. Okay. Yes.
Can I answer? All right. Thank you, Georgi. I would rather answer on the first two questions, which I noted. The first one was, which is good policy, whether this is the policy 1 autocrat versus 10 autocrats. I understand this question like this. I would say that probably the person who asked this question meant the situation that unfolds now, that happens with removing embargoes, oil embargoes on Venezuela, and possible discussions about removing sanctions on Iran in order to diversify the oil supplies. Here we have to understand the power base of Russia. Well, Venezuela and Iran and Russia are all authoritarian states, consolidated authoritarian states, but the power base is different. Russia is almost close to European, half the European state with nuclear power, and which directly violates the norms of international laws. So here again, this is part of the response. This is not as adopted policies. We can't really, I'm not defending here any party, but if we look the processes retrospectively, European Union member countries did all possible things to integrate Russia, to build the gas infrastructure and pipelines, and to build economic relations, right? If we blame European Union for double policies in this regards, I would say that that was policy to appease Russia and to avoid the war in the center of Europe, which did not work because possibly some things that is going within the political spheres of Russia, we don't have some answers on these questions, and we really need to study and research exactly the quality of a Russian political regime. Another question pertained to Azerbaijan. Agree, Azerbaijan's course is a consolidated authoritarian regime. But Azerbaijan was not always supported by Western democratizers. Contrary, if we remember, because of the Nagorno-Karabakh war, Azerbaijan was sanctioned by the US Congress, and Azerbaijani political elites could not receive any assistance until 2001. And also, if we remember the color revolutions and how United States and also European Union treated these processes, they openly said that they preferred evolutionary processes in Azerbaijan. And both European Union and US were quite critical towards what was going on in the internal structure. structures of Azerbaijan. With regard to the invading Azerbaijan, not invading is not the correct word, but the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it has multiple dimensions, including ethnic, territorial, geopolitical dimensions. And internationally, it is recognized that this territory belongs to Azerbaijan. But then we have to be considerate also the role of Russia, which shifted its positions compared to the period of President Elchibey in the early 19s, when Russia supported Armenia, but in 2020 it shifted its position and supported Azerbaijan. So again, great powers use these realpolitik tools to maximize their national interests, but it could not be used as a justification when something extraordinary happens in the international politics. And I think that today is a critical period and critical moment to be more consolidated and responsive to these aggressions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Raluca, I think, wants to speak. And
super quickly.
Yes, and maybe if somebody else speakers super quickly, and then we're finished.
And to the point, I would just mention also the energy transition that the EU has committed to. So the EU is about to invest 300 billion euros to ensure that we move to renewable energies. And so I think you see there the desire to distance itself from oil and gas entirely, not just from Russian oil and gas, but also from any oil and gas coming from authoritarian countries. Obviously, this will be a difficult transition, and things will not be immediate, but the commitment is there. And because of the Ukrainian crisis, I also think the commitment is real. So that's something to consider. Obviously, even with the renewable transition, we were talking about a complex world. Extraction of some of the minerals that we need and the rare earths that are coming from China and the Democratic Republic of the Congo kind of open up a new series of questions that we'll have to address. But again, we live in a complicated world, and we have to accept that and try to find ways to tackle all the different kinds of issues that we're facing. So good luck, because you're the new generation. So I think some of it lies on your shoulders.
Thank you very much. I think we can. Do you want to say something? Okay.
Very, very quickly. Okay. Thanks. Just to answer a couple of things that were brought up, because it was about what we were discussing earlier. Regarding the question about pacifism and using pacifism as a way to justify, let's say, positions of neutrality, if that's something that, which is happening, I would say that the answer is very clear, that if someone is using pacifism as an argument to justify for a position that is effectively the surrender of Ukraine, that would be a good thing, then that is not pacifism. That's something completely different when genocide is being carried out. Secondly, around the question on the the fossil gas from one bad guy, from 10 bad guys rather than one bad guy. I remember, I heard it also during the council of the GP. I don't remember who said it, but I think that this is a statement that is very EU-centered, because from an EU perspective, that makes sense. From an EU perspective, one bad guy with fossil fuels is a really, really big problem. 10 bad guys with fossil fuels is also a problem, but it's a little bit smaller problem from EU perspective. But this is not a statement on the need to be solidaric with people fighting for against authoritarianism in countries that are producing fossil fuels, such as Azerbaijan or Algeria, and exporting them to EU. But it was maybe a little bit clumsy statement. And if you want to continue afterwards, we can also talk. I think that the questions that were brought up about the sanctions was very interesting, because we now see the power that sanctions can have. We don't really know what would happen, for example, if I think it's very unlikely that, for example, if Turkey was to now launch another offense in Syria, it's not likely that let's say Western countries would launch the same sanctions that they launched on the Russian Federation, like freezing the assets of central bank or something like that. We see already how difficult it is for EU to act together in a crisis that is very much existential for many EU countries. And here and now I will stop. I think that what is most important in all of this, I mean, of course, like fossil gas or fossil fuels from zero countries, including democratic ones, is the best. And this is the core of our green project, that we liberate ourselves from what it means to have monopolies or oligopolies of fossil fuel infrastructure, dependencies. We're going to see in Europe and elsewhere in the world how next winter will be. It's going to be a very difficult winter in many different ways, and while keeping the focus on Ukraine if the war is still going on there. It's important that we now have the tools to communicate to the rest of society that the green transformation that we have been advocating for many years, cheap energy, clean energy, hopefully democratic energy, that's not only about solving our biggest existential question, which is the climate crisis, but that's also a question of security.
Thank you very much. That sounds like a very good closing speech as well. And we have a separate session on the energy and the importance of energy for sustaining authoritarianism, but also supporting democracy and importance of it in a transition period. So this is it. Thank you very much, all of us, for attending and for being with us. Thank you, speakers who joined us online. And yeah, there's going to be strong battles ahead, which we have to do. And this is also bit on our shoulders as a young generation that will be living in a very difficult times. But I hope that we will manage to bring the green transition and have zero fossil energy from zero countries and zero autocratic countries on the face of this planet as well. Well, that's a big dream, but I hope it's going to be the case in long years ahead. So thank you very much for joining us, and see you soon at 3 Eastern European time.